Hey guys, this is Restoration for Beginners and welcome back to the garage. And today I wanted to talk to you about spot welds. And if you don't know what a spot weld is, it looks something like this. So you can see that the strut tower is getting held to the unibody with a whole bunch of spot welds, maybe 24, all along here, here, and here. And what a spot weld is, it's just pinching together, and I think it's also called a pinch weld or a resistance weld. It's basically pressing together two pieces of sheet metal together and melting it so that it stays put. And you can also find spot welds in something like this. If I want to remove this, I can see that it's getting held together by a single spot weld. So I would need to kind of punch out or cut that spot weld so I can remove this, which I've already done in a whole bunch of different places in the engine bay. This car is getting engine swapped, so there's a lot of brackets I didn't need. And you might be wondering, hey, what's so difficult about removing spot welds? It seems pretty simple. I agree that it seems like it. So far I've removed maybe 200 plus spot welds, and I know that doesn't give me a lot of street cred. I know that doesn't make me an expert, but that is enough spot welds, and I've made enough mistakes in removing those 200 spot welds for me to confidently say there's a lot more to this than you think. There's a lot of mistakes that you need to avoid, and there's some things that you need to know so you can minimize damage that you need to correct later. And that's what I want to go through. And there's more than one way to cut out a spot weld. Before we get started, of course, please wear the proper PPE to protect yourself. We're going to be making a lot of noise and flinging a lot of dust, rust, and metal particles in the air, none of which you want in your nose, eyes, ears, or lungs. So this is a metal patch we're going to be removing from the unibody for the demonstration, and there's a lot of rust sitting between the panels which have created rust holes in the wheel well. So the first thing that we need to do is to take a wire brush and clean this area up so that we can actually find all of the spot welds we need to tackle. It's a little difficult to see right now because of all the grime and dirt that's sitting on the panel. So after you cleaned up the area and wire brushed it to find as many spot welds as possible, hopefully you identified most, if not all of them. Sometimes it's inevitable that you're gonna miss a few just because, you know, if for instance, if this area was really rusted and you can't see the spot welds anymore, then that's really unfortunate. And also maybe the spot welds aren't prominent enough for you to find right away. Obviously, it's very difficult to pry apart two different pieces of sheet metal with spot welds that you haven't identified or you haven't seen. So you want to avoid that as much as possible. The second thing that you need to remember is probably one side of this is going to get ruined. Because we're working with really old sheet metal here, at this point, the spot welds aren't really the only thing that's holding these two pieces of metal together. There's probably a whole lot of rusted as well. So there's going to be a lot of prying and chiseling and bending involved to get these pieces to separate. Which means it's gonna at least ruin one side of this, and your job is to make sure that the other side, the one that you want to keep intact, remains damage-free as possible. So for me, it's this plate that I don't mind getting mangled. What I want to protect is actually the outside shell that this is attached to, and which is the reason why I'll be attacking from this side and not from the outside. The last thing that you need to think about is what's the order in which you're going to attack this, and this is particularly important. Don't just go about randomly tackling spot welds all over the place. That's a recipe for disaster. You need to find an edge or a corner that you want to start working from and start prying the metal out as you attack the spot welds. Don't try to take out all the spot welds at once and try to remove this pristinely. That's just not going to happen. So I think what I want to do is either work from this edge or maybe this top edge here and then start prying it out, and we'll see how that goes. And if that doesn't go very well, we'll try to figure out something else. What I recommend you do is to take a center punch like this and mark the center of all of the spot welds you can identify. And you don't have to be super precise. I mean, these spot welds aren't perfectly circular sometimes anyway, but being able to work right at the center of the spot welds will prevent a lot of headaches down the line. The next step is to take a drill bit to make the center holes a bit more prominent. And it doesn't really matter which drill bit size you are using as long as it's relatively thin or small. Try not to drill through both of the sheets for obvious reasons, although it can happen if you're working on particularly thin or rusted metal. And the reason why we're doing this will become abundantly clear in a second. So the first method that we're going to try is utilizing this spot weld cutter, and this is a relatively inexpensive tool. You can find it on Amazon for anywhere between 15 to 30 bucks. I'm sure depending on different features and quality, but they all work basically the same. It's a mini hole cutter with a pin or a drill bit in the middle that works with a hand drill to cut out the metal around the spot weld. And these kits come with replacement bits as well, which is nice. It's a simple tool, but it does take a surprising amount of practice to really master. To get started, attach it to a drill, center the pin on the spot weld, and gently start pressing down, and I stress gently here. If you apply pressure too fast, or if your cutter blade is too dull, which is my case right now, it will drift and walk from the spot weld. And this is really why I recommend you drill out a small hole in the middle of the spot weld instead of just relying on the mark made by the center punch, because this thing loves to walk even if you're really careful. Alright, I guess even before attacking the first spot weld, I have to replace the cutter blade, but it's a nice chance for me to show you a trick that I found really useful. It turns out it's really hard to loosen this replaceable cutter blade. I would actually even consider this a major design flaw, since using it tightens the blade over time, so much so that it's hard to loosen, especially since the cutter blade is perfectly round and the pliers can't get a good grip on it. So what I do is sand down the side of the blade so that the plier can get a proper grip, and after that you should have a much easier time loosening it from the bit. Let's get back to it. Like I said before, the trick here is to be methodical and to go slow. You don't want this to cut any deeper than necessary to minimize work that you'll have to do later. If it starts cutting too deep into the second layer, or even worse, if you punch a hole all the way through, that means you'll have to do some work with a welder or body filler to correct those mistakes later. Which doesn't seem like a big deal. I mean, you're not punching gigantic holes, but if you messed up a dozen or dozens of different spot welds, you will regret it just like I will, as evidenced by all the holes that you can see in the background there. I am not proud of those. To be fair though, it is basically impossible to do this so perfectly that you don't make any markings in the second layer. You just don't want to do it. You don't want to cut a lot more than you need to. So don't try to get the spot weld in one shot, especially when you're starting out. Just pause and check your work as you're doing this. You will get the hang of it after a while though, so try to practice on scrap pieces of metal first if you can. But again, it does take as many pauses as you need to make sure you're not cutting too deep. It's important to start attempting to separate the sheets once you have a good edge or a corner done. I drilled out 4 spot welds, and at this point I can start using a flathead screwdriver or a chisel to start checking the work that I did, and if you did it right, you should be able to start prying back the plate just a bit. This is to check your work as you go along, and it'll help you stop drilling more than you have to. If you just try to tackle all of the spot welds at once and you're still not able to separate out the sheets, you won't know where the problem area is, and doing it this way will make sure that you don't move away from an area until the individual spot welds are cut out properly. And if the sheets don't separate like you would expect, either you're missing a spot weld, or you didn't cut deep enough, or your circular cutter didn't cut out entirety of the spot weld for whatever reason. So address this before you move on to a different spot. So there are these welds here on the top left edge that I need to attack before I can progress any further, so I'm going to use this belt sander. By the way, this belt sander will also be utilized to remove spot welds later on, and I'll show you how that's done, but it also comes in handy to remove welds on the edges like this. But since these aren't spot welds, I'll just speed through this section. So back to these spot welds. I've actually heard people say that they can feel it at the moment that the spot cutter goes to the first sheet, so they know that's when they need to stop. And in my experience, that's a bit of baloney. And maybe they're using a different cutter or a lighter drill than I'm using that it's sensitive enough to feel it. But no matter how much I try to recognize it, I didn't feel anything, so I wouldn't say rely on that. What I will say is that sometimes you can actually see a little plume of red dust the moment the cutter goes to the first sheet, and that's actually rust. That's a sign that you've cut through the first layer, so I would say, you know, if you're looking for that sign to let you know when to stop, pay more attention to what it looks like rather than what it feels like. We tackled all of the spot welds on the vertical surface here, but there's like 5 or 6 more spot welds on the frame rail at the bottom. And this is problematic because this is where the spot weld cutter won't work because of the awkward placement. And it's not easy to place the drill perfectly perpendicular to cut it out. And if you can't get it perpendicular, you will not have a good time with the spot weld cutter. You will end up cutting one side of the spot much deeper than the other side, and more than likely you'll end up punching out a hole. And there are other example areas with spot welds that using a drill is just not practical, like this area right here. And if you could fashion up an extension, it may be possible, but I'm going to utilize this chance to show you another method of removing spot welds, which is using the belt sander that you saw earlier. By the way, the divots that we drilled earlier are coming in handy once again, even when we're using the belt sander. Because once the belt sander goes to work, you will quickly lose track of where exactly the spot weld is, and the divot that you placed earlier will allow you to continue to track the center of the spot weld so you don't have to grind away a much bigger area than you have to. So I have a lot of thoughts about this belt sander from Harbor Freight, but I'll keep it short since this isn't supposed to be a tool review. And I forgot how much I paid for this, but it wasn't much more than 30 bucks, and for that reason alone, I can't complain too much. It does get the job done, although I found it, you know, frustrating enough to use that I actually ordered a pneumatic version of the tool, and when it arrives, I'll try to make a separate video comparing the tools and sharing my thoughts more in detail. But back to the point, there's several reasons why you might choose to use this belt sander over the spot cutter. And the most obvious reason is that this is great for removing spot welds in difficult to reach areas because the belt is very narrow and long. It's only a ½ inch across, so you can get into spots where a drill just can't. The second advantage of a belt sander is that you can have much more precision and delicate control in removing spot welds. And I'm using 80 grit sandpaper, which I found to be adequate, but you can use a lot of different grits of sandpaper to really control how fast you're eating away at the sheet metal. And since it grinds away spot welds at a pretty slow pace, you're able to minimize the damage done to the underneath layer. It's actually pretty easy to do this precisely enough that you don't actually have to do any work to clean or fix a spot up after you're done. And the third advantage is that this belt sander doesn't really care how big the spot weld is. So if the spot weld, for whatever reason, is bigger than the size of the spot weld cutter, or if multiple spot welds are clumped up together or overlap together, this is a method that you would want to use. And you can actually see an example of that right here. For some reason this spot weld is enormous, and if I used a spot weld cutter I still wouldn't have been able to separate the sheet metal. And I think sometimes this is the case because these spot welds weren't made by robots, it was done by humans back in the 70s. So depending on how long or how they held it, the spots can be fairly irregular in shape. So although this method is a bit more foolproof than the spot weld cutter in my opinion, you still need to take care not to grind into the second layer of metal. Grind away slowly around the center marker and look for edges to appear. And once you're able to see a complete circle, just like right here, that means that the sheets are able to be pried apart. And sometimes the edges are really faint, so you need to look closely. I got all of the spot welds that I could see, but I'm still having a tough time prying the whole thing apart, and that probably means that I missed one somewhere, and this happens quite a bit. And this is a primary reason why you shouldn't expect to be able to salvage both sheets of metal. And you may be able to, but more than likely you're going to end up twisting and bending one of the sides to try to narrow in on where it's still welded together. And for me, it looks like it's this spot right here in the left bottom corner. And like I said before, sometimes those spot welds are really difficult to identify. And now this is a bit annoying since I really can't see exactly where the spot weld is. So the best I can do is to take a chisel, hammer it, and see where the chisel gets stuck. So I was eventually able to find the spot weld, cut around it, and there you have it. If you were wondering why I was trying to take apart a panel that looked perfectly fine, well, this is why. Alright, so removing this one plate took me about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours. It's probably closer to 2 hours. And I'm absolutely positive that a professional can do this much faster. Somebody else, I'm sure they have better tools. I'm sure they have a better knowledge and skill sets, and I'm sure they can do this faster. But what I realize is, take your time with this. It's not worth it to rush through it and mess it up by punching through a whole lot of holes and warping things that you didn't mean to warp. Just like right here, this is really my first attempts at removing spot welds, and then you can see kind of how bad this is. And it's gonna take me a little bit of effort to just kind of patch up the mistakes that I've made. But again, take your time with this. Don't be afraid to fail, though. And I'll leave you with this thought. I think that it's very appropriate to kind of leave you guys with this, which is there's a saying, something that goes something along the lines of a master has failed more times than a beginner has even attempted. So this is part of the learning journey. I'm enjoying doing this, believe it or not. So you know what? Go out there, work on your own cars. Don't be afraid to fail, but listen to the people who have attempted it before, and hopefully you'll be in a better spot than I was when I first started doing this. All right, have a good night. See you guys later.